Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called 10 more fantastic jazz fusion albums from the 90s. Every now and then I go back to the 90s and I pull out some fusion albums, and these videos always do really well. And I think the reason for that is because in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, there was a real renaissance across the whole music scene. There were some really creative bands that were really selling a lot of records, like bands like Radiohead, Bjork. In the UK you had people like Ronnie Size and Goldie. You had all the stuff that was going on in the dance scene, you had the acid jazz scene. And I think because of that and the fact that CDs were still selling, there was still money to be made, the record companies were willing to put in money to put out jazz fusion albums, and there's some incredible jazz fusion albums in the 90s, especially far greater ones than we had in the 1980s. So this is another exploration into some 90s fusion albums. I've tried to get quite obscure here, and I've tried to explore some certain themes. So I'm going to start out with two albums here that are linked in my mind. The first one is this, which is a compilation album that came out in 1990, and it's called A Certain Kind of Freedom. Now this covers sort of British jazz fusion in 1990. So British jazz had a little bit of a renaissance in the 80s. This was headed by artists like Courtney Pine, Andy Shepherd, Tommy Smith. There was a whole bunch of artists that came out, and they really seem to have come out off the back of that sort of Wynton Marsalis jazz thing that happened in America. But these artists were far more interesting to me because they weren't so embedded in that sort of classic hard bop type of jazz playing. They were exploring a lot more areas. Here in the UK, people like Courtney Pine, Andy Shepherd, Tommy Smith, Django Bates, they all, to a lesser and greater extent, got quite a lot of coverage in the media. Courtney Pine was really had a big documentary about him. The Jazz Warriors, everyone was talking about that. There was a band called the Loose Tubes, and they were sort of spilling out all these players. And a lot of these players, rather than just going out and playing straight jazz, they were exploring fusion ideas. They were also exploring, say in Courtney Pine's case, his sort of the heritage, his sort of British, Afro-Caribbean heritage, which was reggae but also hip-hop. This album that came out was a sort of showcase of sort of British jazz fusion at the time. We've got Mick Talbot from Style Council on here. There's a band called Backbone. I don't know who they are at all. There's a Steve White. He's got a couple of tracks. Who was also playing with Style Council. Lenny Peterson's on here. Who else? Phil Gould from Level 42's contributed a track. Gary Husband's on here, and I'm pretty sure he's playing piano on here. But the reason I bought this was because there was a track by a band called MGM. Spelled EMJIEM, with a track called In the Mould. Now that band, MGM, was short for Mark Mondesir on drums, Michael Mondesir on bass, and Howie Gondwy on guitar. I saw this trio a few times, and that for me was a standout track on that. Right? Now I've just brought this one out because this is a sort of a cool album for me, because it really represented, when I was like 22 years old, what was happening in the fusion scene in the UK at that time. All right, Technics and Blue Note got together and then brought this album out 2 years later, and this is the album that I really wanted to talk about because this was a very big influence on me. And this really covered some of the cutting-edge fusion artists in the UK in the 90s. So it opened up with Alfie Robinson. All right. Now I just check up the lineup because I really want to call out some of the incredible players that were on this. So we've got Leroy Osborne on vocals, guitar, flute. We've got Joe Basharan on piano keyboards, Alfie Robinson on bass, keyboards, vibes, marimba, drum program. Now Alfie Robinson was like, he was, if my memory is right, he was a vibraphone player, but he came to the fore, I think, in the Jazz Warriors. He then signed to Blue Note Records. It was a big signing, and he brought some of this stuff out which is really cutting edge. It's really cool stuff. Next up is Django Bates. Django Bates is one of the great virtuosos of the UK jazz scene, who seems to be almost like a British Frank Zappa. On here he does a track called Three Architects Called Gabrielle, just what I expected, and another track called Up Up. And on this track we've got Django Bates, Martin France on drums, Michael Mondesir on bass, Steve Buckley on saxophone. This is some incredible fusion on here. I was very influenced by this album. You can see all the British jazz musicians there. Next up is Tony Remy, who was really exploring fusion guitar playing, really coming out like John Scofield. There's a track here called Booth, and you're really getting into almost like hip-hop production, dance music production. He's bringing all that in. And this one also features the incredible Cleveland Watkins, who was like a jazz scat vocalist that was really big at the time. So the reason why I wanted to put some shine a light on this is that it really is representing the British jazz fusion scene at that time, and I wanted to call out some of these players. Next up is Sylvan Richardson Jr., and he's playing bass on this, but Sylvan was known as the guitarist with Simply Red. He brings in some really nice stuff on here. He's got he's got Mike Walker on guitar. Mike Walker really is one of the finest jazz or jazz fusion guitarists to come out of the UK. An absolute utter virtuoso. He should be far more well known. He's somewhere between John Scofield and Alan Holdsworth, an incredible player. I've seen him live a number of times, and every time he's just absolutely floored me. So lovely to be able to shout at Mike Walker there. Julian Arguales on saxophone. There's a whole ton of incredible players that are coming out. Then we got Tommy Smith. Tommy Smith was sort of one of these saxophone players along with Courtney and along with Steve Williamson and Andy Shepherd that were really had a spotlight on them at this time. Here he is with Jason Rebello on keyboards, another person that was getting a whole spotlight on them. Anyway, we finally come to this trio here. I'm going to show you this. The Mondesir brothers, there we go. These two tracks were a huge influence on me. Absolutely huge. I listened to them over and over again. There's a track called The 10 Worlds and The Fantastic Four. This lineup is slightly different to the one covered on the CD I just showed you, A Certain Kind of Freedom, in that it's Mark Mondesir drums, Michael Mondesir bass, and then the great Mona Zam on guitar. It was incredible after hearing all this stuff with Courtney, as great as it was, to be able to hear some killing, cutting edge fusion with electric guitar just wailing away. That was really exciting for me. So yeah, those two compilations albums, I don't know whether you can still get hold of them. I don't know if those tracks are out there, but for me they were very important albums in the early 90s. Right, I'm now pulled out 3 albums that sort of from the British jazz fusion scene. So the first one I want to put forward is Acme by Ian Bellamy. Ian Bally sort of came to the notice of many people through his work with the Loose Tubes. The Loose Tubes was sort of a Gil Evans styled big band. It was a huge band that sort of Django Bates sort of headed. It served as a sort of compositional vehicle for a whole ton of British jazz musicians. But when Ian Bellamy then came out and he formed this band Acme, this was full on fusion. This is an incredible fusion album. The lineup is Ian Bellamy on saxophone, John Paracelli on guitar, who was the guitarist with Loose Tubes, Mike Mondesir on bass, and Mark Mondesir on drums. An incredible album. Mark Mondesir, I believe, is one of the greatest drummers that's ever lived, one of the greatest British jazz drummers. I've mentioned him so many times on this channel. I really wanted to give him another shout out, a really incredible drummer that should be more well known because he really is one of the greats. Right. At the other end, we've got an album like this, The Antidote by Ronnie Jordan, the late great Ronnie Jordan. This was in the charts, and there was a single released off this, which was a version of So What by Miles Davis, and he charted in the singles pop charts in the UK. This is when fusion was really having a comeback here in the UK. Ryan Jordan was a sort of Wes Montgomery, Kenny Burrell style jazz guitar player that fused that approach with a sort of almost hip-hop dance music sound. This is very light, it's very commercial, but I did want to mention it because this was a big selling album. I bought it along with everybody else. At the other end of the scale, you had with acid jazz and you had with dance music, an area where sort of fusion impinged on that. This is really coming out of the sort of stuff Giles Peterson was putting out. And there was a record label called the Dorado label, and I've got a compilation album here. I've got a couple of these actually. I just pulled this one out, and this one's called Fine Gold. And on here we've got Jaleesa, D-Note. There's an incredible fusion group called Outside that I absolutely loved at the time. Cool Breeze, APE, Mesh of the Mind, and the Brooklyn Funk Essentials with Take the L Train. I love this album. This is not fully fledged fusion. It's sort of dance music, acid jazz, fusion-esque. It's like almost like a precursor to neo soul but British. I love this album. I loved a lot of the stuff. This is my listening in the early 90s with stuff like that. Right, let's move on. Let's cross the pond, shall we? And just have a quick discussion about another thing that happened in the early 90s. And that's the fact that the Brecker Brothers got back together and they made this album, Return of the Brecker Brothers, right? In the 80s, Michael Brecker had really gone to a much more jazz approach, and these solo albums like his self-titled Michael Brecker and Don't Try This at Home, they're incredible 80s jazz albums. There's a little bit of fusion in there, but they're more acoustic jazz, little bits of electronics. So it was interesting when the Brecker Brothers returned with this album, and this has everything the early 90s technology could throw at it, right? It's a little bit on the hip-hoppy, loopy, sampley side, but it's an absolutely fantastic album. And there's certain tracks on here, I'm thinking Song for Barry, that are full on fusion, you know, and there's also some really funky, loopy stuff on here. Of course, they play incredibly. The lineup on this, if we go through, it is Michael Brecker, Randy Brecker, of course, Mike Stern on guitar. We've got Don Elias on percussion. I think that we've got Dennis Chambers on drums, James Genus on bass, George Whitty on keyboards. That's the basic lineup on this album. Some of the tracks don't have drums on their drum loops, but some of the tracks have live drums on. And I think the track As Above and Below, which is written by Randy Brecker, is a real fusion workout. So it's quite interesting to hear them experimenting with this sort of new hip hop techniques, but also retaining that Brecker Brothers sound. I actually really like this album. It threw up a whole bunch of albums of that era, and another one I brought out which is a little bit more obscure, which I thought I'd just, you know, show you, is this Randy Brecker album, Toe to Toe. This is a little bit more of an introverted affair. Randy sings on here. It's quite funny and it's quite poignant, and it's got some funky stuff. It does err a little bit on the Fuzak side, but nothing that I can't deal with. It's a nice little album that I really liked at the time. Randy Brecker, of course, has become one of the greatest living jazz trumpeters on the planet as far as I'm concerned. Brecker got so much accolades for being probably the most important saxophone player to emerge since 1970, justly, you know, and him dying so young was a tragedy. And sometimes I think it takes away from Randy Brecker, who also is a jaw-dropping trumpet player. Right, I'm going to move on to some collaborations. There was a lot of collaborations that went on in the 90s. I've brought out a couple. The first is this one, straight down the line, Vicious Fusion. There we go. And this is called Show Me What You Can Do. It features Frank Gambale, Stuart Ham and Steve Smith. When I did my top 50, was it, jazz fusion guitarist, Frank Gambale came pretty high. I think he's an utter genius on guitar. I think he's done things on guitar that nobody else has done. He's got sort of an Alan Holdsworth level technique, a completely individual approach. but some of his compositions can be a little bit on the light side. So it's lovely to hear him in this power trio setting without a keyboard player, where he's really got to riff it up, and he does. And on the final track, which is called Lydia's Love Van, which is in the Lydian mode, Frank Gambale just destroys, but he destroys all the way through this. It's lovely to see Stuart Hamm in this fusion setting. Steve Smith's fantastic. This is one of the great brutal fusion albums. You know, if you like that sort of brutal fusion, I know you do, go and check that one out. Here's another one that I haven't pulled out. I've done a lot of videos on Terry Bozzio, but I haven't really shone a light on this one. Of course, it would be a Blacklight, and that's Blacklight Syndrome, which features Terry Bozzio, Steve Stevens, which of course was Billy Idol's guitarist, and Tony Levin. That's a strange lineup. Steve Stevens is interesting. It's interesting to hear him in this context. Sometimes I feel like he's a little bit out of his depth, but in an interesting way, because he is primarily a rock guitarist, and it gives it an edge. This is a cool album, especially for Terry Bozzio and Tony Levin fans, and it's heavy. So there's some collaborations, right? And this isn't really a collaboration, but it's an anomaly. And I thought I'd give a shout out to this album by Tribal Tech, which is called Thick. This album's not liked that much by the Tribal Tech fans. I'll tell you why. Because they really just went into the studio and they jammed, and it's actually quite an avant-garde album. I absolutely love it. I think it's one of their best albums. It's just different, that's all. Those tight arrangements and those sort of joint bebop lines that Tribal Tech are so known for, you don't get that so much from here. It's not entirely improvised. There seems to be some structure in this, but it's pretty loose. Scott Henderson is also, at this point, really exploring that blues way of playing. He's moved away from the sort of more Holdsworthy bebop influence approach that he had in the 80s, and I think a lot of people like that. But this is a fantastic album, but you've got to treat it differently. I think if it hadn't come out under the Tribal Tech name, perhaps it would have been perceived different, but of course it wouldn't have got anything like the sort of profile that it would under this name, you know. I really love that album. Right, so I'm going to finish up with two Bill Laswell produced albums, right? The first one is this one by Ronald Shannon Jackson, okay? Ronald Shannon Jackson came to the fore drumming with Ornette Coleman. He's a free jazz meets fusion drummer. He's one of my favourite drummers, a completely different approach to most fusion drummers to playing drums. In the 80s he formed Last Exit with Bill Laswell, Sonny Sharrock and Peter Brotzman, and that is some of the most extreme brutal music on the planet. But he also had his own band called the Decoding Society. They made an incredible album in 1985 called Decode Yourself, which features Vernon Reid on guitar from Living Colour. That's a fantastic album, and this carries on in this tradition. It's a really dark Afro heavy metal fusion album. It's absolutely fantastic. I love this album, and it features, let's just go to the lineup, Eric Pearson on alto and baritone saxophone, Zane Massey alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, Lee Rossi soprano saxophone, Henry Scott trumpet, David Gordon trumpet, Robin Eubanks trombone. So you've got this big brass section. It's like a heavy metal big band. It's totally unlike anything you're ever going to hear, this album. We've got Akbar Ali on violin, Vernon Reid on guitar, Onajay Allen Gums, who was one of the great fusion keyboardists on DX7. We've got two bass players, and they both play at the same time. We've got Bruce Johnson on electric bass and Melvin Gibbs on electric bass. I think Melvin Gibbs may have gone on to play with Black Flag. I might be wrong there, you know. But this is where the avant-garde jazz fusions are almost like meeting heavy metal. We got Ronald Shannon Jackson on drums. It's produced by Bill Laswell. It's got that Bill Laswell sound, but it's also a Ronald Shannon Jackson album. I really wanted to mention Ronald Shannon Jackson and this album and Decode Yourself and a whole bunch of other albums he made, which are incredible fusion. Right, I'm got to my last album. Right, if you count it, there's 12 because we had two Brecker Brothers and we had two sort of British jazz compilations albums. The last album is this. The late great Bernie Worrell, who was keyboardist with Parliament Funkadelic, made this album, produced by Bill Laswell. It's absolutely mind-blowing, incredible. The lineup is just unbelievable. Bernie Worrell Hammond organ and mini moog, clavinets, harpsichord and synthesizer. George Clinton on vocal. Bootsy Collins on bass. Gary Mudbone Cooper on vocal. Maceo Parker alto saxophone. Fred Wesley trombone. So that's basically Parliament Funkadelic, right? But this album is sort of much more Afro electronica, hip hop, funk fusion. It really is. We've got Bill Laswell on loops, beats, sound effects and samples, and I can never say this guy, and I've had to say it so many times on this channel, Ayeb Dieng on cowbells and percussion. That's the Bill Laswell sound there. And then we have on drums Sly Dunbar from Sly and Robbie, and the great Tony Williams on drums. And on here, and this is just recorded just before, you know, Tony Williams sadly passed, we've got 2 tracks, right? We've got which ones are they? I'm never going to be able to work this out, am I, from these liner notes? I think it's Blood Secrets and I think Disappearance, I'm not too sure, or is it The Vision? But anyway, there's a couple of tracks which are just organ, Bernie Worrell's organ, and Tony Williams on drums, and Tony Williams is just playing so well, and with Laswell's production he just sounds fantastic. It's one of the great Tony Williams later performances. I've talked about his sort of return to form with fusion form on the Arcana albums that Laswell also produced just before he died, and this is the other one, so I really wanted to mention this. So there's 12, not 10, you always get a little bit more for your money on my channel. There's 12 albums from the 90s that you may find interesting. I hope some of them have piqued your interest and you can run off and try and find them. Some of them might be quite hard to find. Anyway, I'm at the end of the video. I hope you like this. Please, if you did, like, subscribe, and if you've got any comments about some of these incredible artists that I've just blasted through, all these amazing artists that we haven't mentioned on this channel, then please put it in the comments and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.